Hello again. Um, I'm hopeful that at this point you've had a chance to take a look at the previous lecture that's talking about the social and political impact that the war in Vietnam has on American life here at home. The other thing that I want you to understand about this period is you begin to see the evolution of American culture as well. Now, think back to the 1950s. Think back to this age of affluence and what comes to mind as far as culture is concerned. I'm hopeful that one of the things that comes to mind is the culture of conformity, that there was this really deep impulse in American life to fit in and to be the same and aspire to the same things. By the mid-1960s, that had begun to change, and people began to rethink this culture of conformity. And one of the primary reasons for that was the emergence of what comes to be known as the counterculture. Okay? Now, what was the counterculture? Well, first of all, it's emerging in the 1960s. That's significant in and of itself. But generally speaking, what the counterculture was a rejection of this middle-class affluence and a rejection of the culture of conformity. It was rejection of rigid social norms like segregation, the Cold War consensus, and in general embrace things like women's rights, social diversity, and most importantly, independent thinking, things that were not exactly smiled upon by the culture in American life in the 1950s. The easiest way that I have for you to understand the counterculture is really what you're talking about is the hippie movement, right? These flower children that are really driving three fundamental issues home with respect to their counterculture. And you'll see that here in a minute. Tenet number one is going to be free love. Tenet number two is going to be drugs. And tenet number three is going to be rock and roll. Together, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Anyway, where did this come from? Do you remember me talking about the beatnik culture? Remember me talking about in the 1950s there was a segment, although it was tiny, it was very small. There was a segment of American society that also hated this rigid culture of conformity, and they experimented with recreational drugs and Eastern religions. I'm talking about people like Jack Kerouac, this underground culture, primarily in Greenwich Village, New York, or San Francisco. Well, although they rejected this culture of conformity, for the most part, they were underground. You didn't see them very often. And the other thing about the beatnik culture was that they weren't really trying to destroy fundamental aspects of American life, like marriage, for instance. That's where the beatnik culture kind of diverged from what will come to be known as the counterculture. But at any rate, the counterculture grows out of this beatnik culture. Now, tenet number one, right? The free love movement. There's a common misunderstanding about hippies in America, and most people will tell you that the hippies were protesters. Not exactly. The way that I like to think of it is a lot of hippies, a lot of protesters became hippies. But you have to understand that the student movement that SDS is leading and this hippie movement, they're two different animals. They do overlap, sort of like a Venn diagram, but not always and not, especially not initially. The point that I really want to drive home is that there were a few hippies that were readers, so to speak. They weren't intellectuals like how they have been perceived in modern times. Anyway, the few people that actually read within the hippie movement read a guy by the name of Norman A. Brown, who wrote this book called Life Against Death. And it became not only the Bible of the counterculture, it really called into question the institution of marriage. And think about that. Those of you that are married will know exactly what I'm talking about. There's a document that's incredibly important that you hold in your pocket, if you're the groom, of course, throughout the entire ceremony. And that's got nothing to do with love notes or your vows or anything like that. It's a marriage license. Because what marriage ultimately is a state-sanctioned, state-recognized institution. These two people are married. I mean, think about what the religious official or the state official says right before you two get hitched. By the power invested in me by the state of wherever, Yeah. The hippies believed that this was oppressive on so many different levels, and that love and relationships, generally speaking, needed to be entered into voluntarily. And I mean, how voluntary is a legal contract? I mean, it's done out of obligation, legal obligation. So my point is, the free love movement meant that the hippies were trying to destroy the institution of marriage. Now, they're not trying to destroy it simply for the sake of destroying it. It's about purifying the human soul. Now, there's another aspect that we need to talk about with respect to this free love movement, and that's the issue of sexual freedom. Now, in addition to being very rigid as far as sexual norms, the 1950s really exemplified this double standard men and women had. There's a lot of people within the hippie movement that said women would never have social freedom unless you had sexual freedom, and there was no way that women were going to have sexual freedom without birth control. It's women, after all, that do get pregnant, not the other way around. Therefore, in order to be on the same social level as a man, free sex, that was going to require an effective form of birth control. Well, in the 1960s, we get the first 99.9% proof positive form of birth control, which is the pill. So this is enhancing the hippie movement's ability to be able to spread its free love movement. Now, what I'd like you to understand about the free love movement, sexuality became a human right. It wasn't necessarily something that was looked down upon. It wasn't something that was taboo within the hippie movement. It was something that was supposed to be shared between men, women, men, women, women. I mean, one of the other things that the free love movement emphasized was love comes in many different forms, and a lot of times those forms are homosexual relationships. So generally speaking, what I'd like you to write down next to the free love movement, this was a rebellion against civilized sexuality. Okay? Now, tenet number 2 was the drug movement within the hippie culture. Now, we're talking about a time period in which there had been these hard narcotics that began to seep out into mainstream American life, and one of those drugs was a drug that was referred to as LSD, and many of you know it by its street name, which is acid. And many of you know that the effect that acid has on the human mind is that it alters your mind. It makes you see things, hear things, taste things, feel things that are not necessarily there. It's a hallucinogenic drug. Now, the people that took acid in the 1960s were taking it, as they said, to expand their mind. In other words, there was only so much that the human brain could process on its own, and in order to get in touch with the reality of the world, you needed some help, and this is what acid offered. Let me give you an example. There was a young professor at Harvard University, a guy by the name of Timothy Leary, and he was a really straight arrow. I mean, he never even so much as smoked marijuana before his experimentation with magic mushrooms and eventually acid. Well, on vacation in Mexico, he had ingested magic mushrooms, and what he said was this lifted the veil for him. The way that I like to think about this, you're familiar with Plato's allegory of the cave? Shadows on the wall, right? You can't see the people behind you, you can only see the shadows, and you can't really know what reality is. It could be people, or it could be somebody that's kind of playing puppet master. What Leary is saying is taking acid, in this case, would lift the veil so that you could be in touch with the reality. So he takes this mentality back to Harvard, where he begins to put his graduate students on hard drugs, including acid, and he encourages people to drop out of school and involve themselves within this drug movement. It was not a situation where you could sharpen your mind by going to class day after day. It was better to take this other route. Now, how does this merge with the third tenet of the hippie movement, which is rock and roll? If you're familiar with this time period in rock and roll history, you know that the 1960s are described as this psychedelic style, right? Psychedelic decade. bands like Jimi Hendrix or The Doors, tie-dyed shirts, you know what I'm talking about. Well, that concept came from a guy in California, a guy by the name of Ken Kesey, who, for lack of a better way of putting it, just basically ran a drug commune house. He teamed up with the quintessential hippie band of the era, the Grateful Dead, and while the Grateful Dead would play these really loud shows in parking lots in the middle of fields, Ken Kesey would be out in the crowd handing out free doses of acid, and people would say they could taste the sounds, or they could feel the colors, or things of that sort. So you're beginning to see this merging of free sex, free drugs, and rock and roll. But rock and roll in general in the 1960s began to assume a different character. It was always rebellious. I mean, even in the 1950s, it was breaking social norms, but I'm talking about anti-authoritarian style. You know, think about bands like the Rolling Stones, Jefferson Airplane, Buffalo Springfield, the Beatles later on in the 1960s, and of course the Doors. Now, 1967 was pretty much the high point of the hippie movement, and the hippie capital of the United States was the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco. So in 67, all these flower children start pouring into San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district, and basically they start living like hippies, which is a rejection of this middle-class life and a celebration of poverty. In 1967, what you've got is the high point of the hippie movement and the cultural event of the hippie movement, which was the Summer of Love. Now, you've got music festivals like the Monterey Pop Festival. You've got free food, free drugs that are being passed out. One of my favorite things, the free clinic. Doctors, physicians actually offered free health care for the masses, people that suffered from, I don't want to say everyday diseases, but, you know, venereal diseases that were curable or at least treatable, but couldn't afford to do this through conventional means, were treated by the clinic. And as I said before, the Summer of Love was the cultural event of the hippie era. Now, in the aftermath of 67, you begin to see the decline of the hippie movement. Many people will tell you that the high point of the counterculture was Woodstock. Well, not especially. The significance of the counterculture, to some extent, was that it served as a political handicap for the new left and students for a democratic society. If you think about it, it's not that far off out there to say that it's pretty tough to organize politically when you're high. But anyway, it was distracting them from political organizing, and furthermore, a lot of these people that were hardcore activists within SDS began to be labeled as hippies, even though they weren't necessarily per se, and that's something that gets branded with both the institution of protest, but also the left in general, the political left in general, in the aftermath of the 1960s. Now, the other thing that you see that produces a decline in the movement is officials cracking down on drugs. LSD was big news in the 1960s, the same way that meth is in this day and age. And so what narcotics officers did was arrest a lot of these people that were handing out free drugs, and it became harder and harder to get those drugs. So you know what happens when something becomes more and more difficult to procure. The quality generally goes down. A lot of people took acid in the later 1960s, but they took acid that was laced with other hard narcotics like PCP or speed. One of those individuals was a guy that was living in California and had been running another one of these drug communes, a guy by the name of Charles Manson. He was a crazy hippie that convinced his followers that a race war was right around the corner, and long story short, they went on a killing spree. So this is the dark side of drugs. You know, people were expecting to find peace blowing in the wind. Instead, what they found was murder with kitchen utensils. Very brutal killings. The free love movement. A lot of people misinterpreted that. It wasn't an excuse or a license for promiscuity. What it was about celebrating the love of the other human being. Well, a lot of people saw that as an excuse to have a lot of one-night stands, which turned into a lot of venereal diseases, which turned into the downside, the ugly side of the free love movement. So if you're doing the math with me, there's a big swing and a miss for the drug movement, a big swing and a miss for the free love movement, so that of course leaves rock and roll. Woodstock was 3 days of peace, love, and rock and roll. People came together in upstate New York, overcame the elements. It rained and it was muddy, but people got along. Came off without a hitch. Well, the West Coast's answer to Woodstock was the Altamont Festival in San Francisco, or around San Francisco. And the headline band would be the Rolling Stones. Well, Altamont learned a lot from Woodstock, and one of the things that it desperately wanted was some crowd control. So the Rolling Stones hired security guards, only they weren't professionally trained security guards. What they were motorcycle gangsters, a group of individuals that called themselves the Hells Angels. Now, if this isn't bad enough, you've got bikers that are running security for you. They didn't pay them in cold hard cash, they paid them in beer. So again, think about this. You've got bikers that are good and drunk. What's going to happen when somebody gets out of line? You get the idea, right? So at Altamont, you had a man that was stabbed to death by the Hells Angels, and it showed the downside or the dark side of rock and roll. So again, that's strike three. Now, what is the impact of the counterculture? What is the impact of the hippie movement? I think that the counterculture really sold themselves short by the time that the decade ended. That they had set out to change the world and nothing got done. I think a lot more got done than they gave themselves credit for. And issue number one is a critique of authority. Now, some of this is coming from the credibility gap, and some of it's coming from the whole idea of, asking the question why. Why is something a social norm, and why should I follow it blindly? So one of the things that began to be said throughout the hippie movement was never trust anybody over the age of 30. It's very youthful in its orientation. Another really important impact of the counterculture was the sexual revolution. This time period and hereafter, it becomes permissible for women to ask men out on dates. It becomes permissible for couples to go Dutch, so to speak. She pays for the movie, he pays for the popcorn concessions, or whatever the case may be. Anyway, sexual norms were loosened much, much more than what they were in the earlier 1950s culture conformity era. Lastly, we see a transformation of American culture, and generally speaking, it became more relaxed. The wearing of blue jeans became much more permissible. We dressed down, so to speak. Some people think that that's a good thing. Some people think it's not so good thing. But in general, the thing that the hippie movement really did in American life was relax us, loosen the standard, so to speak, of day-to-day life. I hope that has elaborated on what the Vietnam War and this particular era in American history has done when it comes to influencing change in American life.